Here we go. Let's read some more of Kenny and the Dragon. We are up to chapter 9. A well-willed chap. As Kenny bolted off the main street in Roundbrook, he knocked over a cart of dragon trinkets, and they spilled near a group of townsfolk who were sharing a keg of ale and laughing loudly. As he scurried past them, he heard one exclaim, "I bet 7-1 that the dragon flambles the old coot, flambees the old coot in 5 minutes. It's going to be a roasting good time." "I can't wait," another added. "It'll be bat time up the old hill tomorrow. A scorcher for sure." A boy sitting with the group spied Kenny and ran into the alley, blocking his way. "Hey, you live up on that farm near the hill, don't you?" he asked. "I heard you seen that dragon up there. Did ya? Maybe eating a cow or something." Kenny had seen this prickly kid before in school. He was a couple of years older and a couple of pounds heavier, hence his nickname Porky. "Yeah," he said, looking Porky in the eye. That fiery feeling was still in his stomach. "I've seen the dragon, and there isn't going to be a fight tomorrow." So forget about it. Kenny's heart was pounding. He waited for the wallop to come from the young ruffian. "Now, don't you worry your little head," Porky's father said. He put his burly hand on Kenny's shoulder reassuringly and slowly separated the two boys. "If old George can't get that beast, well then, we'll all go up there and kill him. Right, boys?" Amidst the whooping of the revellers, Kenny wiggled free and took off as fast as his legs would take him, leaving Roundbrook far behind. It was almost sunset by the time Kenny arrived back at his little farmhouse. His father was bringing the sheep in from the fields, and he could smell the aroma of vegetable stew as he approached his front porch. A cool breeze welcomed him home amidst a trio of chirping crickets. Kenny slumped through the house and flopped down on his bed. He pushed all of his pillows off the covers and got under his blanket, staring at the cracked, patched ceiling. Why couldn't this be like a fairy tale? Why did the dragon... Why did the dragon have to show up and be a good dragon? Why did the only person in town who just happened to be a dragon slayer also happen to be my only friend in the world? He looked down at his bookshelf and gazed at the books that George had given him over the years. In some of them, there were wizards and witches who could give you enchanted weapons or supernatural powers that allowed you to overcome your foes and save the day. Kenny's life didn't have these villains intent on doing nothing but bad things. It was more complicated than that. Come to think of it, he had no foes, really, except now maybe all the townfolk who had come to witness this battle. Sure, he thought, this could be the most famous battle of all time. Folks had heard about something this big, but they've never seen anything like it. But these are my friends, and they're betting on who will win. "Kenneth," his mother interrupted his thoughts, "I've invited someone for dinner who really wants to see you." Kenny pulled his ears over his eyes and rolled over in the bed. "I don't want to come out, Mum. I just want to stay in here." "I think you should get up, son," his mum said as she entered his room and put his folded laundry in his dresser. She sat down on the bed and stroked his furry head. "I just made you a bowl of my vegetable stew, and there are fresh butter rolls for dipping." "Is there ginger beer?" Kenny asked, peeking out from under his ear. "No," his mother answered as she rose and went to the door, "but your friend has brought you some birch beer, so wash up and come on out for dinner." Kenny washed his hands and face and peered into the kitchen. Sitting at the table with his mum and dad was George. "Hello," the boy said, plopping down in his chair and staring at his stew. "Hello, Kenny," said George. "I hope you don't mind me following you back home. I wanted to talk to you about tomorrow." Your parents tell me the dragon is quite a well-willed chap. And Grahame, Kenny interrupted. His name is Grahame. Well, perhaps this Grahame and I can have a chat about tomorrow and see to is that Grahame like the cracker? Indeedy it is, Kenny's father said through a mouthful of butter roll, but with an E on the end. Those are good, George said, as if he was savouring the thought of them. Kenny looked at him for a moment, and then stared down at his stew, but he wasn't feeling hungry. He wondered if the old codger ever felt the river stones in his stomach. It almost seemed like the knight was having a harder time talking here at the dinner table than anything else. It was odd to think this was the same George who'd been so gallant, so chivalrous earlier this afternoon astride his proud mount, and the same George he had known all those years who had never left his bookshop. Anyways, George continued, if this friend of yours is as good a spirit as you've said, well, then perhaps we can converse about the upcoming event and sort something out. What do you say? Kenny looked up from his soup bowl. George wasn't just some weapon for the king to wield whenever he wanted, after all. Whatever anyone had expected of him tomorrow, the knight was here with Kenny, willing to make amends. Really? He said. You'd do that? Certainly, George replied with a smile. A friend of yours is a friend of mine, remember? Good. I'm glad that's settled, said Kenny's mother, because I've already invited Grahame for dessert and coffee. He should be here any minute. Kenny looked up and smiled at his mother, then his father and George. All three were smiling back. Through the window, over their shoulder, he could see the familiar round shape of the dragon bounding across the twilight field toward their house. He took a deep breath, swallowed the stone in his throat, and hoped that dessert would go as well as dinner had. Chapter 10. A Dragon and His Wrath. I brought some new poems to recite over dessert. Is it creme brulee again tonight? Grahame asked as he pushed his large head through the window to hover next to the dinner table. He smiled his toothy grin when he saw Kenny, then noticed the old fellow with the white beard and moustache sitting at the table. Ho there, we've got some company. Mayhaps a fellow poet? Kenneth, why don't you introduce your friend to Grahame? His mum asked. Any friend of Kenny's is a friend of mine, as long as it isn't that daft knight sent to execute me, Grahame snorted. George fake coughed a little. Actually, this is him, Kenny said. Grahame, meet my old friend George. George, this is my new friend Grahame. Kenny bit his lip and held his breath. His father slurped his second helping of stew, while his mum quietly got up from the table and started washing the dishes. George and Grahame eyed each other for some time, waiting for the other to speak first and break the uncomfortable silence. So, George said at last, I can say I haven't seen a dragon in many, many years. In some ways, it's like seeing a familiar face. Yes, well, get used to it, said the dragon in an icy tone. This is one face that is not leaving the area any time soon, either by hook or by crook. Are we clear on that, Beowulf? Now, said George, rising. There is no need for that kind of name-calling. What else should I call you? Enlighten me, great saviour. The drake responded. Kenny could see a wisp of smoke wafting from Grahame's nostrils. He wondered if he should stand between the two of them to keep the peace. But he caught his father's eyes and was silently spoken to. Of course, you know what I'm talking about when your mum or your dad talks to you with nothing more than a look or a glance, and nary a word is said. Kenny understood and remained in his chair, appearing calm as his parents were clearly doing. Beowulf was a barbarian, an uncultivated lout. I am none of those things. I have been trained under the king himself in the proper manner for dragon removal. And I agreed, Grahame said. Agreed what? Stammered George. Kenny and his parents exchanged glances. I agree Beowulf was a barbarian. He couldn't just dispatch of Grendel. He had to swim down to his home and butcher his mother as well. George blinked. Precisely. He looked at Kenny, who noticed the slightest curl of a smile hiding underneath his moustache. Now, what he should have done was lock up that insolent ogre and have him do hard labour for his injustices. Interesting, Grahame said as he paused. as he paused a moment and looked at Kenny. Do you think a ruffian like that can truly be reformed? And there it was. Kenny realised he had been holding his breath the entire time, and he finally let it out with great relief. He and his parents watched and listened as George and Grahame discussed Beowulf and whether Grendel could become an upstanding member of society. Things were going swimmingly by the time coffee was served, and the two reminisced about adventures they'd had in their youth. There were jokes and laughs afterwards as the dragon bruleed the desserts with a flicker of flame from his left nostril. Everybody went out to the front porch so that Kenny's father and George could enjoy their after-dinner pipes. You know, Grahame, Kenny was right. You are wonderful company. I haven't had good dinner conversation like that in dog's ages. George said as he shook the dragon's large scaly paw. Agreed. You really are a well-read good fellow, Grahame replied, lighting George's pipe for him. I suppose we do have a lot in common. He looked over at Kenny. Well done, little batling, well done. Holy smokes, what's that? Kenny's dad asked as he pointed with his pipe stem. A line of bobbing lights was streaming from the centre of Roundbrook towards Shepherd's Hill. Everybody stared at the sight for the first time. Well, 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 George said with a sigh. Are those all night fishermen? Asked Grahame. Those are people getting ready for tomorrow, said Kenny. The Riverstone feeling was back, and he wondered if they all felt it as well. Yep, son, his father replied, sucking on his pipe. I believe you are correct. That's a mess of people, Kenny's mother added, knitting nervously, and they are coming with a lot of expectation. You boys are not going to be able to get out of this easily. Kenny watched the procession across the bridge, over Parish Creek, and down the road towards Shepherd's Hill. He swallowed down the river stones and allowed the gears in his head to click and whir. He thought of what George had taught him about planning ahead for his moves in chess. He had just gotten his two friends to see eye to eye, but how was he going to do the same with an entire town? His father creaked back in his rocker. I heard people were betting on who was going to come out on top of this ruckus. Sorry, George, but a lot of them was betting against you. George chuckled as he drew a long puff off his pipe. He sighed. Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. What can you expect from an old retired shopkeeper? And you know what they say, come not between a dragon and his wrath. Heh, that's from King Lear, Grahame said, watching the bobbing lanterns gathering around the bottom of the hill. One of my favourite performances from Shakespeare. I wonder if he ever met a dragon. He'd certainly know what to do with a crowd like this. And the gears in Kenny's brain finally all clicked into place. That's it, Kenny squealed, causing everybody to jump. I know what we have to do, and we don't have much time to do it. Everyone inside.